As a house burns, a dog's relentless determination to stay inside baffles firefighters. What they find is unforgettable. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The morning sun cast gentle shadows across the well-maintained lawn of 247 Maple Street, where Sarah Matthews sat on a checkered blanket with her 6-month-old daughter Emma. Buddy, a 4-year-old golden retriever, maintained his usual watchful position nearby, his amber eyes never straying far from the baby. The late spring air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming magnolias from the neighbor's yard. Sarah had adopted Buddy from the local shelter 2 years before Emma's birth, and since bringing the baby home, the dog had appointed himself as her personal guardian. He would sleep beside her crib, alert to every sound, and follow Sarah whenever she carried Emma through the house. Some might have called it overprotective, but Sarah found comfort in his dedication. At 10:47 a.m., while Sarah was preparing Emma's bottle in the kitchen, the events that would test their bonds began to unfold. The house's aging electrical system, stressed by the recent installation of a new air conditioning unit, finally gave way. A spark in the wall behind the kitchen counter ignited the insulation, and within minutes, smoke began seeping through the electrical outlet. Sarah first noticed something was wrong when Buddy's behavior suddenly changed. His ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled in his throat, a sound she had never heard from him before. Then came the acrid smell of burning plastic. Sarah turned to see thin wisps of smoke curling from behind the microwave. Her first instinct was to grab Emma from the living room playpen, but as she rushed toward her daughter, a sudden burst of flames erupted from the kitchen wall. The fire spread with frightening speed, feeding on the old wooden framework of the house. Sarah reached the playpen just as a section of the ceiling collapsed behind her, cutting off their path to the front door. In the chaos that followed, Sarah's heart pounded against her ribs as she clutched Emma to her chest. The smoke was thickening rapidly, making it difficult to see and breathe. She moved toward the side door, but the handle was already hot to the touch. Trapped between two advancing walls of flame, Sarah made a split-second decision to place Emma back in the playpen. It was elevated and away from the immediate danger, while she tried to find another way out. But as she stepped away from Emma, another section of the ceiling gave way, separating her from her baby. Through the thickening smoke, Sarah saw Buddy dart past her, leaping over the fallen debris to position himself next to the playpen. His barking became fierce and determined, a clear message to anyone who might approach. The baby was under his protection. Sarah found herself pushed back toward the front of the house by the intensifying heat. She could hear Emma crying and Buddy's continuous barking, but the flames now formed an impenetrable barrier between her and her child. The smoke was becoming unbearable, forcing her to retreat to the front porch, where she began screaming for help. Through her tears and coughs, Sarah could still hear Buddy's barking from inside. Unlike the panicked sounds of a frightened animal, his barks were steady and purposeful. He wasn't trying to escape, he was standing his ground. The neighbors who had gathered on the street could see him through the window, his figure silhouetted against the growing flames, refusing to leave his post beside Emma's playpen. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the morning air, but to Sarah, they seemed impossibly far away. She watched in helpless horror as the flames consumed more of her home, while Buddy's barking continued unwaveringly from within. The dog she had rescued 2 years ago was now risking everything to protect her child, demonstrating a loyalty that transcended mere instinct or training. As the first fire truck rounded the corner, Sarah's screams merged with Buddy's barks and Emma's cries, creating a desperate chorus that would haunt the memories of everyone present at 247 Maple Street that morning. The scene was set for what would become a testament to the extraordinary bonds between humans and animals, and the unexpected heroes that emerge in moments of crisis. Fire Captain Jake Morrison had seen hundreds of house fires in his 15-year career, but something about this call struck him differently the moment they turned onto Maple Street. The dispatcher's voice had carried an unusual urgency. Dog refusing to leave baby inside burning structure. Through the windshield of Engine 47, Jake could already see the thick black smoke rising against the morning sky. As the truck screeched to a halt in front of 247 Maple Street, Jake's trained eye immediately assessed the situation. The fire had already compromised at least 30% of the structure, with flames visible through 3 ground-floor windows. The smoke's color and density indicated the fire had reached the internal framework. They had minutes, not hours. "Chief, we've got a mother out front and confirmed baby and dog inside," Lieutenant Rogers shouted over the sound of the engine. Jake watched as 2 of his men rushed to restrain Sarah Matthews, who was fighting to get back into the house. Her clothes were singed, and soot covered her face, but her eyes remained fixed on a window where the silhouette of a large dog could be seen through the smoke. Jake grabbed his breathing apparatus while issuing rapid commands to his team. "Martinez, Watson, establish water supply. Chun, Rodriguez, ventilation. Sullivan, with me on rescue." The practice choreography of his firefighters contrasted sharply with the chaos of the scene, where neighbors had gathered behind the hastily established perimeter tape. The first attempt to enter through the front door revealed the severity of their situation. The temperature inside had reached critical levels, and the structural integrity of the entrance hall was already compromised. Through his mask, Jake could hear the distinct sound of a dog barking. Not the panicked yelps he usually heard from animals in fires, but determined, almost aggressive barks. 2 firefighters managed to reach the living room, but quickly retreated. "Cap, the dog won't let us near the baby," Sullivan reported through the radio. "He's showing teeth. We can't get close without risking injury to everyone involved." The words triggered a memory Jake had kept buried for 3 years. His own dog, Max, a German shepherd who had died protecting Jake's niece from an intruder. The same protective instinct he now heard in this dog's barks. The same unwavering loyalty that had cost Max's life. Standing at the threshold of the burning house, Jake removed his helmet for a moment, feeling the intense heat on his face. The action drew confused looks from his team, but he needed this moment. Understanding an animal psychology could mean the difference between success and failure in the next few critical minutes. "Sullivan, give me a status report on the structural integrity of the west side," Jake commanded, his mind already formulating a new approach. "Martinez, redirect the water stream to protect the living room window. We need to buy more time." The dog's barking had become more urgent now, accompanied by the renewed cries of the baby. Jake knew that in situations like this, standard protocol called for prioritizing human life over animals. But his experience told him that in this case, the dog wasn't just another variable. It was potentially their greatest asset or their biggest obstacle. Through his earpiece, Jake heard the updated structural assessment. The west wall was still holding, but the ceiling showed signs of imminent collapse. The temperature readings from the thermal cameras were climbing rapidly, and the smoke was getting thicker by the second. They needed to act fast, but any wrong move could spook the dog and make the situation worse. Jake gathered his team for a rapid briefing. "Listen up. This isn't a standard extraction. That dog in there isn't panicking. He's protecting. We need to change our approach." He could see the skepticism in some of their eyes, but years of working together had built a foundation of trust that ran deeper than conventional wisdom. As Jake prepared to implement his plan, he caught sight of Sarah Matthews being treated by paramedics. The look in her eyes reflected both terror and unwavering faith in her dog's protective instincts. In that moment, Jake made a decision that would challenge everything he'd learned in his firefighting career. Sometimes he realized saving lives meant trusting the very instincts that seemed to be working against them. The next few minutes would prove crucial, as Jake prepared to enter the burning house with a different strategy. One that went against standard protocol, but might be their only chance to save both the baby and the loyal dog who refused to abandon his post. Jake's radio crackled with urgent updates as his team worked to contain the spreading flames. The fire had now engulfed nearly half the house, but they had managed to establish a defensive line around the living room where Buddy and the baby remained. Through the thickening smoke, they could still hear the dog's steady barking, a sound that was becoming more labored but no less determined. Water pressure holding at 75%, Martinez reported from the engine. "We've got another truck 3 minutes out." Jake acknowledged the information, while studying the thermal imaging display. The heat signature showed the fire was moving across the ceiling, threatening to cut off their last viable entry point. Jake made his way toward the side entrance, his movements deliberate and measured. Years of experience had taught him that animals in crisis situations respond to energy and intent as much as actions. He removed his mask, a decision that drew sharp intake of breath from nearby firefighters, and began speaking in a clear, steady voice that carried over the chaos of the scene. "Hey, buddy," he called out, using the name he'd heard Sarah shouting earlier. "We're here to help. We're here to help the baby." The dog's barking pattern changed slightly, barely noticeable to others, but Jake caught the shift in tone. He continued speaking as he moved closer to the entrance, maintaining a constant flow of calm, reassuring words. The rest of the crew maintained their positions, following Jake's earlier instructions to hold back unless signaled. The fire roared overhead, and support beams groaned under the increasing stress. Every firefighting instinct screamed for immediate action, but Jake kept his movements slow and deliberate as he approached the doorway. Through gaps in the smoke, Jake could now see Buddy more clearly. The golden retriever stood firm beside the playpen, his fur darkened with soot, but his stance unwavering. His barking had decreased in volume, but his eyes remained fixed on Jake's approaching figure. The baby's cries had grown weaker, a concerning sign that drove home the urgency of their situation. "Sullivan, report on structural integrity," Jake commanded through his radio, his voice remaining steady despite the rising tension. The response came back immediately, southeast corner showing critical stress. 5 minutes, maybe less before potential collapse. Jake removed his heavy gloves, knowing he needed the dexterity for what came next. The heat was intense, but he kept his movements slow and non-threatening. "You're doing a good job, buddy," he continued speaking to the dog. "Such a good job protecting the baby. But now we need to get you both out of here." The smoke had become so thick that Jake could barely see the playpen, but Buddy's outline remained visible, his tail held high and alert. The dog's barking had ceased entirely now, replaced by a low growl that seemed more uncertain than threatening. Jake recognized this as a crucial moment, the shift from protection to potential cooperation. Sarah's voice carried from outside, coached by Jake's team on what to say. "It's okay, buddy. Let them help." The dog's ears perked at his owner's voice, and Jake saw his opportunity. He reached slowly into his pocket and produced a piece of leather equipment, something he'd grabbed from the truck, remembering how his own dog had responded to familiar scents and textures. The fire's roar grew louder, and chunks of ceiling began falling around them. The baby's cries had become worryingly faint, but Jake maintained his focus calm. He noticed Buddy's nose working overtime, processing the scents through the smoke, Jake's presence, the leather, the increasing danger to his charge. Sweat poured down Jake's face as he edged closer, speaking continuously in that same measured tone. The heat was becoming unbearable, and his lungs burned from the smoke, but he could see his approach was working. Buddy's posture had shifted slightly, his growl transforming into something closer to a whimper, not from fear, but from recognition of a potential ally. The radio burst to life again. "Captain, structural integrity critical. You need to move now." But Jake kept his movements controlled, knowing that rushing now could undo everything. He was almost within reach of the playpen, and Buddy had taken a half step back, not in retreat, but in what appeared to be consideration. In this moment, suspended between disaster and rescue, Jake realized they had reached the turning point. The next few seconds would determine whether his unconventional approach would save lives or end in tragedy. The fire raged around them, but in this small pocket of space, time seemed to slow as man and dog reached a crucial understanding. Fire Chief Mark Reynolds stood at the command post, his weathered face illuminated by the dancing flames of 247 Maple Street. 30 years of firefighting experience weighed heavily on his shoulders as he watched Jake's unorthodox rescue attempt unfold. The situation stirred memories of his childhood dog, Rex, who had pulled him from a frozen pond when he was 12, a debt of trust between humans and animals that had shaped his entire career. "All units hold positions," Mark commanded through the radio, silencing several objections before they could be voiced. He understood the risk Jake was taking, but he also recognized something in this situation that went beyond standard protocol. The thermal imaging monitors showed dangerous structural degradation, but Mark made the calculated decision to give Jake the time he needed. The rescue team had divided into strategic positions around the house. Martinez and Watson maintained the primary water line, creating a protective barrier around the living room. Chin and Rodriguez had established ventilation points to manage smoke flow, while Sullivan coordinated the secondary response team, ready to move in at a moment's notice. Each firefighter at the scene carried their own burden of memories and loss. Rodriguez had lost his brother in a house fire 10 years ago. Chin had rescued countless pets from burning buildings, but had also seen too many they couldn't save. Watson still volunteered at the local animal shelter, unable to forget the ones that didn't make it out. Chief, northwest corner showing critical stress patterns, the structural engineer reported, pointing to rapidly changing heat signatures on the monitor. Mark nodded, absorbing the information while maintaining his focus on the larger situation. He could see the confusion and concern on the faces of the younger firefighters, and used to seeing such a departure from standard rescue procedures. The gathered crowd of neighbors had grown, held CK by police barriers. Their murmured prayers and worried conversations created a background chorus to the operation. Mark noticed Sarah Matthews being attended to by paramedics, her eyes never leaving the house where her baby and dog remained trapped with Jake. 3 minutes until second engine arrives, dispatch announced through the radio. Mark acknowledged while checking the wind direction for the 1,000th time. Any change could rapidly accelerate the fire's spread or push the smoke in a more dangerous direction. The weight of command pressed down on him as he balanced the lives at stake against the rising risk to his team. Through his earpiece, Mark could hear Jake's steady stream of calm words to Buddy, punctuated by the increasingly urgent status reports from his team. The thermal imaging showed the temperature in the living room climbing steadily, approaching critical levels. Standard protocol demanded immediate intervention, but Mark held firm, trusting Jake's instincts. Sullivan approached the command post, his concern evident even through his protective gear. "Chief, we're seeing signs of imminent collapse in sectors 3 and 4. We need to pull Captain Morrison out." Mark held up his hand, his eyes fixed on the rescue attempt unfolding through the smoke-filled doorway. The memories of his own experiences with Rex flooded back. The absolute trust, the unspoken understanding between human and animal. He remembered how Rex had ignored his own safety, focused only on pulling his young master from the freezing water. That same dedication was visible in Buddy's stance, in his unwavering protection of the baby despite the growing danger. "All units maintain positions," Mark repeated into the radio, his voice carrying the authority that had earned him his command. "Be ready to move on my order." He could feel the tension in his team, their training urging them to act, to rush in and force a rescue. But sometimes, he knew, the bravest action was to wait, to trust in something deeper than protocol. The fire had now spread to over 60% of the structure. Support beams groaned under the intense heat, and sections of the roof had begun to sag alarmingly. Mark kept one eye on the structural indicators while maintaining radio contact with Jake, ready to call an immediate evacuation if the situation deteriorated beyond their safety margins. Each passing second felt like an eternity as Mark watched the delicate dance between Jake and Buddy through the smoke. The success or failure of this rescue would likely define his career, but more importantly, it would determine the fate of 2 innocent lives. The next few moments would prove whether his trust in Jake's approach had been wisdom or a terrible mistake. Inside the burning house, Jake could feel the structure groaning around him as he inched closer to Buddy and the playpen. The heat had become almost unbearable, and without his mask, each breath was a struggle against the thickening smoke. But he maintained his slow, deliberate movements, knowing that any sudden action could shatter the fragile trust he was building with the protective dog. "That's right, Buddy," Jake continued speaking, his voice growing hoarse from the smoke and heat. "You've done such a good job protecting the baby. Such a good job." He was now close enough to see Emma clearly in the playpen. The infant's cries had weakened to whimpers, but she was still conscious, protected from the worst of the smoke by Buddy's position and the playpen's elevation. A section of ceiling crashed down behind them, sending sparks and debris flying. Buddy flinched but held his ground, his eyes never leaving Jake. The dog's fur was matted with soot, and his breathing had become labored, but his determination remained unshaken. Jake could see burns on the dog's back where embers had fallen, yet Buddy showed no sign of abandoning his post. Through his radio, Jake heard Chief Reynolds' voice. For minutes on, Structural failure. Status report. Jake keyed his radio with his free hand, keeping his movements smooth and controlled. Almost there, Chief. Dog is responding. Baby still conscious. Need 2 more minutes. The leather equipment in Jake's hand had caught Buddy's attention. The dog's nose worked overtime, processing the familiar scent through the chaos of smoke and fire. Jake remembered how his own dog, Max, had responded to leather. It was a scent associated with safety, with trust. He held it out slowly, letting Buddy make the choice to investigate. The baby needs fresh air, Buddy, Jake said quietly, maintaining eye contact with the dog. We need to get Emma out of here. You and me together. He used the baby's name deliberately, having heard Sarah call it out earlier. Buddy's ears twitched at the sound of Emma's name, and Jake saw the first real shift in the dog's protective stance. The temperature was reaching critical levels. Jake's exposed skin felt like it was baking, and his lungs screamed for clean air. But he forced himself to maintain his steady approach. Buddy had taken a half step away from the playpen, his head tilted slightly as he processed Jake's presence and words. Sullivan, move the team into position, Jake commanded through his radio. Be ready for rapid extraction. He could hear his men acknowledging, positioning themselves to move in the moment he gave the signal. The building shuddered around them, and more debris rained down, but Jake maintained his focus on Buddy. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Buddy took another step back from the playpen. His posture remained alert, but the aggressive protection had transformed into something closer to cautious cooperation. Jake saw his opportunity and took it, moving forward with the same measured pace. Good boy, Jake rasped, his throat raw from the smoke and heat. Such a good boy. He was now within arm's reach of the playpen. Buddy watched intently as Jake slowly extended his hand toward Emma, his movements telegraphed and non-threatening. The baby's skin had taken on a concerning pallor, and her breathing was shallow. Jake knew they were running out of time. The fire's roar had grown deafening, and the structural groaning of the house had reached a fever pitch. But still, he forced himself to move with deliberate care. Buddy's transformation in that moment was remarkable. As Jake carefully lifted Emma from the playpen, the dog's entire demeanor shifted from protector to assistant. He pressed close to Jake's leg, as if understanding that their roles had merged. They were now working together to save the child he had guarded so faithfully. Team, move in now, Jake commanded, cradling Emma with one arm while keeping his other hand near Buddy. The dog stayed close as they began their retreat, his body language now focused on escape rather than protection. But their path to safety was far from clear, and the inferno around them was reaching its climactic point. Outside the burning house, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The fire had breached the roof, sending columns of black smoke into the morning sky. Chief Reynolds watched the structural integrity monitors with growing alarm as red warning indicators multiplied across the display. All teams be advised. Critical structural failure imminent, the engineer reported, his voice tight with urgency. North wall showing severe compromise. Roof collapse likely within 3 minutes. The information rippled through the rescue teams, causing a visible tension in their already rigid postures. Martinez adjusted the water flow, trying to maintain a protective barrier around Jake's escape route, but the fire's intensity was overwhelming their efforts. Chief, we're losing pressure on the main line, he shouted over the roar of the flames. The second engine was still 2 minutes out, 2 minutes they might not have. The gathered crowd had grown silent, watching in horrified fasc. In Ation, as sections of the roof began to cave in. Sarah Matthews had broken free from the paramedics and pushed forward to the safety line, her face streaked with tears and soot. My baby, she screamed as another portion of the roof collapsed with a thunderous crash. Inside their command post tent, Chief Reynolds made rapid calculations. The thermal imaging showed critical heat levels throughout the structure, with multiple points of imminent failure. He grabbed his radio, knowing the next few moments would determine the outcome of this rescue. "Captain Morrison, you need to move now," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years of experience. "Building's going. Get out immediately." The static-filled response from Jake was barely audible over the fire's roar, but the message was clear. They were on their way out. Rodriguez and Chen repositioned their ventilation equipment, trying to create a clearer path through the smoke. "East side completely compromised," Chen reported through the radio. "Fires breaking through the walls." The situation was deteriorating faster than their models had predicted. Sullivan assembled his rapid response team at the front entrance, ready to move in if Jake needed assistance. The heat was so intense that their protective gear was reaching its thermal limits. "Chief, permission to advance and assist with extraction," Sullivan requested, his concern evident in his voice. But before Chief Reynolds could respond, a massive section of the roof gave way, crashing through the second floor and sending a shower of burning debris toward the ground. The impact shook the entire structure, and flames burst through windows that had previously been clear. "All teams fall back," Chief Reynolds commanded, watching in horror as the building began to disintegrate. "Emergency positions now." The firefighters retreated from their positions, the water streams now focused solely on preventing the fire's spread to neighboring houses. Sarah's screams merged with the sound of cracking timber and shattering glass. The paramedics moved forward, preparing for potential casualties. The police pushed the crowd back further as burning debris rained down across the front yard. Through the chaos, Chief Reynolds maintained his focus on the thermal imaging screens. Somewhere in that inferno, Jake was moving with precious cargo, and every second counted. The structural engineer's voice cut through the radio chatter. "Complete collapse imminent. 60 seconds max." Martinez and Watson redirected their water streams, attempting to maintain some kind of escape route. But the fire's intensity had become overwhelming. The second engine sirens could be heard approaching, but everyone knew it would arrive too late to affect the immediate situation. Sullivan's team held their position at the perimeter, every muscle tense and ready to move. The heat had become so intense that the paint on the fire trucks was beginning to bubble. Chief Reynolds watched the countdown on his monitor, knowing that the next minute would determine whether this rescue would end in triumph or tragedy. The building gave another tremendous shudder, and more of the roof caved in. Through the gaps in the smoke and flames, there was still no sign of Jake, Buddy, or Emma. The structure was quite literally falling apart around them, and time had run out. Inside the disintegrating house, Jake cradled Emma against his chest while navigating through the burning maze of fallen debris. Buddy stayed pressed against his leg, no longer just a dog being rescued, but an active participant in their escape. The golden retriever's instincts seemed to guide them away from weakened floor sections, his body language communicating dangers that Jake's equipment couldn't detect. "Sullivan, east entrance is gone," Jake reported through his radio, his voice barely audible over the inferno. "Moving to secondary exit." The baby in his arms had grown disturbingly chew. And Jake could feel the heat penetrating his protective gear. Every step required careful calculation as burning debris continued to rain down around them. Firefighter Michael Torres, who had entered through the back to assist Jake, appeared through the smoke like a ghost in protective gear. "Cap, we need to move faster," he shouted, already reaching out to help stabilize Jake as they maneuvered around a collapsed beam. The floor beneath them groaned ominously with each step. Buddy suddenly stopped, his body going rigid. Jake had learned to trust the dog's instincts, and he immediately halted their progress. Seconds later, a massive section of ceiling crashed down directly in their intended path. The dog's warning had saved them from being crushed, but it had also cut off their planned escape route. All exits compromised. Torres reported through his radio, the stress evident in his voice. Looking for alternatives. The heat had become so intense that their protective gear was approaching its limits. Jake could feel the baby's shallow breathing against his chest, each moment in the toxic environment decreasing her chances of survival. Through the gaps in the smoke, Jake caught glimpses of the structural collapse happening around them. Support beams twisted and failed, and walls buckled under the intense heat. They were running out of both time and options. Buddy's ears perked up, his head turning toward what had once been the dining room. "Follow him," Jake commanded Torres, trusting the dog's instincts over their increasingly unreliable equipment readings. Buddy moved with purpose now, leading them through the smoke-filled chaos. The floor shifted beneath their feet with each step, threatening to give way completely. Another section of the house collapsed behind them, sending a pressure wave of heat and debris that nearly knocked them off their feet. Torres grabbed Jake's shoulder to stabilize him, ensuring the baby remained protected. Through his radio, they could hear Chief Reynolds increasingly urgent commands for them to find an exit. Buddy stopped again, this time pawing at what remained of a wall. Jake's years of experience kicked in as he recognized what the dog had found, a window that had been partially obscured by fallen debris. It wasn't on any of their exit plans, but it might be their only chance. "Torres, help me clear this," Jake ordered, shifting Emma carefully to maintain his protective hold while working to create an opening. The window frame was hot enough to burn through their gloves, but they managed to clear away the worst of the obstacles. Buddy stayed close, occasionally tugging at Jake's pants leg when debris shifted dangerously near them. The building gave another tremendous shudder, and Jake knew they were out of time. The floor was beginning to slope, indicating imminent structural failure. Torres had managed to clear enough space for them to attempt an exit, but the drop to the ground below would be treacherous. "Command, we found a way out," Jake reported, "but we'll need immediate assistance on the west side." He could barely hear the acknowledgement through the static and roar of the fire. Emma stirred weakly in his arms, reminding him that every second was critical for her survival. Torres went first, climbing carefully through the window to help receive Emma. The heat had warped the frame, making every movement a struggle against melting materials and sharp edges. Jake looked down at Buddy, seeing the same determination in the dog's eyes that had kept him protecting Emma throughout this ordeal. The final moments inside the burning house stretched into an eternity of heat, smoke, and crucial decisions. They were about to attempt a dangerous escape with a critically vulnerable baby, guided by the remarkable instincts of a dog who had already proven himself a hero. The next few seconds would determine whether their desperate gambit would end in rescue or disaster. The window opening provided their only chance of escape, but it presented its own set of deadly challenges. Jake watched as Torres positioned himself outside, arms ready to receive Emma. The drop was roughly 12 feet, complicated by burning debris and unstable ground below. Inside, the temperature had reached levels that were causing their equipment to malfunction. "Ready to receive," Torres called up, his voice barely audible over the roar of the collapsing structure. Jake looked down at Buddy, who stood steady despite his injuries, then at Emma, who needed immediate medical attention. The sequence of their escape would be crucial. One wrong move could doom them all. Jake made a split-second decision. "Torres, move slightly left," he commanded, positioning himself at the window. With practiced precision, he began lowering Emma through the opening, ensuring his grip remained secure despite his heat-damaged gloves. The baby stirred weakly, a small whimper escaping her smoke-irritated lungs. Just as the transfer began, the floor beneath Jake shifted violently. Buddy let out a warning bark as support beams gave way somewhere deeper in the house. The entire structure groaned like a dying animal, and Jake felt the window frame begin to buckle under the structural stress. "Now!" Jake shouted, carefully releasing Emma into Torres' waiting arms. The firefighter immediately cradled the baby and moved away from the building, where paramedics were rushing forward with oxygen and medical equipment. One threat had been neutralized, but Jake and Buddy remained in critical danger. The floor's angle had become treacherous, and more of the ceiling was collapsing around them. Jake turned to Buddy, knowing the dog would struggle to jump with his injuries. "Come here, boy," he called, reaching for the exhausted animal. But Buddy suddenly backed away, his eyes fixed on something behind Jake. Through the smoke and flames, a sound cut through the chaos, a sound that made Jake's blood run cold. A baby's cry, coming from deeper within the burning house. Buddy's behavior suddenly made terrible sense. The dog wasn't afraid to jump. He was trying to tell Jake that their mission wasn't complete. "Command, we have a second victim," Jake shouted into his radio, already knowing how impossible the situation had become. The building was literally falling apart around them, and they had barely escaped with Emma. Going back and seemed like certain death, but Buddy had already made his decision. The dog turned and began moving back into the inferno, his purpose clear. Jake found himself faced with an impossible choice: follow safety protocols and escape, or trust this remarkable animal one more time. "Torres, maintain position," Jake commanded, turning away from the window. "There's another baby inside." He could hear Chief Reynolds' immediate response through his radio, ordering him to evacuate immediately, but Jake was already following Buddy into the smoke-filled corridor. The dog moved with surprising speed despite his injuries, leading Jake through the burning maze. The floor had become a shifting landscape of debris and structural failure, but Buddy seemed to know exactly where to step. They passed through what had been the kitchen, now unrecognizable in its destruction. Jake's breathing was becoming labored even through his reactivated oxygen mask. The heat had intensified to near unbearable levels, and his equipment was warning of imminent failure. But Buddy pressed forward, and Jake followed, trusting in the dog's unwavering determination. They reached a closed door, partially blocked by fallen debris. Buddy began scratching frantically at the base, and Jake could hear the cries more clearly now. Someone had hidden a second child in this room, perhaps in a desperate attempt at protection, and only Buddy had known. The door was hot to the touch, even through Jake's gloves, and the surrounding walls showed signs of imminent collapse. They had seconds, not minutes, to attempt this second rescue. Jake looked at Buddy, seeing in the dog's eyes the same dedication that had protected Emma. Together, they faced what could be their final moments in the burning house, knowing that whatever came next would require every ounce of courage and strength they had left. Jake threw his weight against the door, the wood splintering under the combined effects of fire damage and force. Buddy squeezed through the opening the moment it appeared, disappearing into a room thick with smoke. The building shuddered around them, and Jake could hear Chief Reynolds through his radio ordering an immediate evacuation of all ground teams. The structure was entering its final stages of collapse. Through the smoke, Jake spotted Buddy standing next to a heavy wooden dresser. Behind it, barely visible, was a makeshift barricade of furniture, and within that protective fortress lay a second baby, wrapped in wet towels. Sarah had created an improvised safe room, using every mother's instinct to protect her child from the fire. "Second baby located," Jake reported through his radio, his voice strained. "Need immediate extraction support." The response was lost in a crash of falling debris, but Jake was already moving. Buddy stood guard as Jake carefully navigated the unstable floor, every step accompanied by the ominous sound of structural failure. The baby, a boy, Jake realized, was conscious but struggling to breathe in the toxic air. The wet towels had provided some protection from the smoke, but time was running out. As Jake reached for the child, Buddy suddenly barked a warning. Jake instinctively pulled back, just as a section of ceiling crashed down where he would have been standing. The room was rapidly becoming an oven, with temperatures approaching the failure point of Jake's protective gear. He could feel the heat penetrating his suit, and his oxygen supply was running critically low. But Buddy's presence remained steady, the dog's focus unwavering despite his own injuries and exhaustion. "Going to need you one more time, boy," Jake said to Buddy as he finally reached the baby. The dog's ears perked up, understanding in his eyes. Jake carefully lifted the infant, noting with relief that someone, presumably Sarah, had wrapped him in fire-resistant blankets beneath the wet towels. Their exit route had been cut off by falling debris, but Buddy was already moving, finding paths through the chaos that Jake's equipment couldn't detect. The dog's low-to-the-ground perspective and instinctive understanding of structural stability proved invaluable as they navigated the burning maze. The baby stirred in Jake's arms, a weak cry piercing through the roar of the fire. Outside, Jake could hear the desperate shouts of his team and the sound of water cannons trying to buy them more time. The building was coming down around them, but Buddy pressed forward with unwavering determination. They reached a section where the floor had partially collapsed, creating a treacherous slope of burning debris. Buddy paused, testing each step before proceeding, showing Jake the safe path. The dog's own fur was singed, and burns covered his paws, but he showed no sign of slowing. Through gaps in the smoke, Jake caught glimpses of the outside world. Flashing lights, firefighters in position, medical teams standing ready. They were close to escape, but the final stretch would be the most dangerous. The heat had intensified to the point where Jake's equipment was failing, and his vision was becoming blurred from smoke and exhaustion. Buddy suddenly stopped, his body going rigid. Jake immediately halted, trusting the dog's instincts. Seconds later, a massive section of the second floor crashed down ahead of them, blocking their planned exit route. The dog didn't hesitate, immediately turning to lead them down another path, one that Jake wouldn't have considered viable. The baby in Jake's arms needed immediate medical attention. Every second they spent in the inferno decreased the child's chances of survival. But Buddy moved with such certainty that Jake found himself trusting the dog's judgment over his own professional experience. Their newfound exit path led them toward what had once been a laundry room. The smoke was so thick that Jake could barely see his own hands, but Buddy's golden fur provided a beacon to follow. The dog's movements had become labored, the toll of his heroic efforts finally showing, but his determination never wavered. The sudden arrival of an unfamiliar car had drawn everyone's attention away from the burning house. The woman who emerged was Laura Matthews, Sarah's sister, her face contorted with horror as she realized what was happening. Her scream pierced through the chaos. "The twins! Sarah, you were watching both twins today." The revelation hit the rescue team like a physical blow. The second baby was Noah, Emma's twin brother, who had been sleeping in a separate room when the fire started. Sarah, still being treated by paramedics, broke down completely. In her panic and confusion during the initial chaos, she hadn't been able to communicate that there were two babies inside. Inside the burning structure, Jake and Buddy had reached a critical point. The laundry room window offered their final chance of escape, but the glass had partially melted from the intense heat. Every surface was scorching, and Jake's equipment was reporting total failure of its protective systems. Buddy, despite his exhaustion and injuries, suddenly lunged forward with renewed energy. Using the last of his strength, the dog crashed into the weakened window, his body breaking through the softened glass and creating an opening. The action sent him tumbling outside, where he landed roughly on the ground below. "Dog is out," came the shout from the rescue team outside. "Captain Morrison, report status." Chief Reynolds' voice crackled through the failing radio. Jake was already moving toward the opening, cradling Noah protectively against his chest. The drop was significant, but they had no other options left. As Jake positioned himself at the window, the entire structure gave a final, devastating groan. The second floor was coming down, and this time there would be no escape if they were caught inside. With professional precision honed by years of experience, Jake maneuvered through the opening, protecting Noah from the broken glass and twisted metal. The landing was hard, but controlled. Medical teams rushed forward as Jake rolled to protect the baby from impact. Noah was immediately taken by paramedics, who began emergency treatment for smoke inhalation. But Jake's attention was already elsewhere, searching for the dog who had made this miraculous rescue possible. Buddy lay a few yards away, surrounded by medical personnel who were treating his burns and injuries. Despite his obvious pain, the dog's eyes remained fixed on the babies as they received emergency care. His tail wagged weakly when he saw both Emma and Noah being tended to, as if understanding that his mission was finally complete. The house gave one final, thunderous crash as it collapsed completely. The assembled crowd watched in awe as the structure fell in on itself, realizing how close they had come to losing everyone inside. Sarah, having fought her way past the paramedics, rushed to her children, gathering them in her arms as the medical team continued their work. What happened next would be talked about in the fire department for years to come. Buddy, despite his injuries, managed to stand and limp over to where the twins were being treated. The The dog who had before been so fiercely protective now gently nuzzled each baby, as if performing a final check of his charges. Sarah wrapped her arms around him, her tears soaking into his smoke-stained fur. Jake watched the scene unfold as his own injuries were treated. In all his years of firefighting, he had never witnessed such a remarkable demonstration of loyalty and intelligence. Buddy had not only protected one baby, but had refused to leave until both children were safe, understanding something that even the human rescuers hadn't known. In the days that followed, the story of Buddy's heroism spread far beyond their small town. The dog's burns would heal, leaving scars that became badges of honor. The fire department officially recognized him as an honorary member of their rescue team, and his picture would hang in the station house alongside other heroes who had risked everything to save lives. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came in the quiet moments at home, where Buddy resumed his watch over the twins, now with an even deeper bond. Sarah would often find him sleeping between their cribs, always alert to their needs, always ready to protect them. The fire had revealed what they had always known, that sometimes the greatest heroes come with 4 legs and a heart big enough to risk everything for those they love. The events of that day changed everyone involved. Jake instituted new protocols for working with animals in rescue situations. Chief Reynolds developed training programs that incorporated the instincts of protective pets, and the entire department gained a deeper respect for the extraordinary bonds between humans and animals. But most importantly, they had witnessed firsthand that courage knows no species, and that true heroism often comes in the most unexpected forms.